Military conquest. Colonial powers often used military force to conquer and subdue indigenous peoples, enabling them to establish control over territories and populations. An example is the colonization of the Americas by European powers, such as Spain, Portugal, and England. Violence and coercion. Violence, intimidation, and coercion were commonly used to subjugate populations and compel individuals into servitude. This could include threats of violence, physical abuse, and punitive measures against those who resisted enslavement. The Atlantic slave trade involved the abduction, capture, and transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas under brutal and violent conditions, where they were forcibly enslaved on plantations and in mines. Divide and rule strategies. Colonial powers often employed divide and rule strategies to weaken resistance and maintain control over populations. This involved exploiting existing social, ethnic, and tribal divisions within communities, fostering mistrust and conflict, and pitting groups against each other to prevent collective resistance to colonial rule. The British colonial administration in India used divide and rule tactics to exploit existing religious and ethnic tensions, fostering divisions between Hindus and Muslims to maintain control over the Indian subcontinent. Deception and betrayal. Colonialists frequently employed deceptive tactics to exploit local populations, such as making false promises or agreements that were later broken, deceiving individuals about the terms of labor or servitude, or manipulating local power dynamics to their advantage. The colonization of Africa by European powers often involved deceptive treaties and agreements with local leaders, which were later violated or manipulated to facilitate the exploitation and enslavement of indigenous populations. Cultural suppression and assimilation. Colonial powers sought to suppress indigenous cultures and identities, often through policies of forced assimilation, cultural erasure, and the imposition of colonial languages, religions, and customs. This undermined traditional social structures and identities, making populations more vulnerable to exploitation and control. The imposition of Christianity and European cultural norms on indigenous peoples by Spanish conquistadors in the Americas involved the suppression of indigenous religions, languages, and cultural practices, undermining traditional social structures and identities. Economic exploitation. Colonial powers exploited economic vulnerabilities and inequalities to coerce individuals into servitude. This could involve manipulating trade networks, controlling access to resources, or imposing unfair labor practices that forced individuals into dependency and debt bondage. The British Empire's exploitation of India involved economic policies that impoverished local populations, leading to widespread poverty and debt bondage, which facilitated the recruitment of Indian laborers for colonial projects and industries. Legal and institutional systems. Colonial powers established legal and institutional systems that legitimized and perpetuated slavery. These systems often discriminated against indigenous populations, denying them basic rights and protections, and providing legal frameworks for the enslavement and exploitation of individuals. The institution of chattel slavery in the southern United States was supported by legal and institutional systems that denied enslaved individuals basic rights and protections, treating them as property rather than human beings. Capture and trafficking. Colonial powers engaged in the capture and trafficking of individuals, including raids on communities, kidnapping, and the purchase of enslaved individuals from local traders or intermediaries. This involved the brutal practice of capturing people from their homes and forcibly transporting them to distant colonies for labor exploitation. The Arab slave trade in East Africa involved the capture and trafficking of individuals from the interior to coastal regions, where they were sold to Arab and Swahili traders and transported across the Indian Ocean as enslaved laborers. Racial hierarchies and ideologies. Colonialists promoted and enforced racial hierarchies and ideologies that justified the enslavement of certain racial or ethnic groups. This involved the propagation of racist beliefs and stereotypes that dehumanized and marginalized indigenous peoples, making it easier to justify their subjugation and exploitation. The concept of racial superiority was used to justify the enslavement of African peoples by European colonizers, who promoted racist ideologies that portrayed Africans as inferior and suitable for servitude. Forced labor systems. Colonialists established various forms of forced labor systems, including chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and debt bondage, which subjected individuals to lifelong servitude and exploitation. These systems often involved harsh working conditions, physical abuse, and limited opportunities for freedom or escape. The Spanish encomienda system in colonial Latin America subjected indigenous peoples to forced labor on plantations and in mines, where they were exploited for the benefit of Spanish colonial elites.